There is a moment when you first step inside a great cathedral, when something happens to you that you cannot quite name. The noise of the world outside cuts off as if a curtain has been drawn. The air changes, the light changes, and then, before you have taken 3 steps, something else changes too. Something deeper, something that has nothing to do with what you are seeing and everything to do with what the building is quietly doing to the inside of your chest. You are not imagining it. The stone around you is alive with a frequency, not a sound you can point to, not music, not a voice, not the echo of footsteps. Something lower than that. Something that settles into your bones before your ears have had any time to react. And it has been happening to every person who has walked through these doors for the last 900 years. Most people assume that the builders of the great medieval cathedrals were concerned with God, with stone, with the ambitions of bishops and the rivalry between cities. And they were all of those things. But there is another story, one that has been sitting in plain sight inside these walls for centuries. One that architects and acoustic engineers have been quietly uncovering for the last few decades, and one that changes, in a very fundamental way, what we think these buildings were actually built to do. Here is the first thing to understand, and if you make a sound inside an ordinary, modern room, a word, a clap, a note, it dies in roughly half a second. The walls absorb it, and the air swallows it, and it is gone. But if you make that same sound inside the nave of a Gothic cathedral, something different happens. The sound does not die, it travels, it climbs the stone columns, crosses the high vault, reflects from wall to wall, and it comes back to you, richer, fuller, changed, anywhere between 5 and 8 seconds later. 5 to 8 seconds. In that interval, a single sung note fills the entire interior of the building with a sound that no single human voice could ever produce alone. The builders who designed these spaces knew this. The question that has been slowly, quietly driving researchers to distraction for decades is how deeply they knew it and how deliberately they used it. That is what this story is about. Their names, for the most part, are gone. Not misplaced, gone. Deliberately, so in many cases, because these were men who worked inside a tradition that placed no great value on personal credit, who passed their knowledge through whispered instruction and worked example rather than written record, and who understood that the deepest things they knew could not survive in writing anyway. They were called masters of the lodge. They were the architects, the site managers, the geometric calculators, the acoustic designers, and the priests of a discipline so old and so carefully guarded that its full extent has never been mapped. Consider the master who designed Rome's cathedral, one of the most extraordinary buildings in the Western world, a building whose interior acoustic properties have been studied obsessively by modern researchers and have still not been fully explained. The man who conceived that building, who decided on the proportions of its nave, the curve of its vaults, and the placement of its chapels, the angle of its walls, his name is not known. He left no drawings that survive, no letters, no accounts, no commemorative stone. He left only the building and the sound it still makes in the deep quiet of early morning. when the tourists have not yet arrived and the stone holds nothing but air and memory. This was not unusual. The records of medieval cathedral construction are surprisingly sparse on the subject of their designers. We know the names of patrons, the bishops who commissioned the building, the kings who funded them, the abbots who dedicated them. We know the names of some of the craftsmen who worked on specific decorative elements, but the masters who conceived the overall forms, who understood the geometric systems that governed the proportions of the whole, these men are largely invisible to history. And that invisibility was, to a significant degree, a choice made by the tradition they belonged to. In what we do know about the master builders comes from a few surviving lodge manuscripts, from the records of cathedral construction accounts, and from the buildings themselves, which, if you know how to read them, speak with extraordinary precision about the knowledge their makers possessed. And what the buildings say is this: these men understood things about the behavior of sound inside enclosed spaces that go well beyond anything they should have been able to understand, given what we believe they knew. They had no instruments to measure frequency, no devices to visualize wave patterns, no mathematical framework for calculating reverberation times, and yet cathedral after cathedral, century after century, from the 12th to the 15th, they produced buildings whose acoustic properties are not random, not accidental, and not even primarily the result of their structural requirements. The acoustic behavior of a Gothic cathedral is a product of choices, specific, consistent, repeatable choices about proportion, about shape, about the placement of masses and voids. How did they make those choices? Where did the knowledge come from? The answer, as it turns out, does not begin in medieval France, and it does not begin in the Christian tradition at all. It begins much earlier, in a lineage of knowledge about the relationship between space and sound that runs back through Rome, through Greece, through Egypt, and into a period of human history so remote that we have barely begun to take its sophistication seriously. The master builders of the medieval period were not inventors. They were inheritors. And what they had inherited was something so old, so carefully transmitted, and so fundamentally strange that even today, with all the tools of modern science at our disposal, we have not fully recovered what they once knew. Start with a wine glass. You know what happens. It has become something of a parlor demonstration. When a trained singer holds a note at exactly the right pitch, the glass does not simply vibrate, it shatters. Not because the sound was loud, because the sound was precisely right, so because the frequency of the note matched the frequency at which the glass itself preferred to vibrate. And in that moment of perfect correspondence, the energy transferred from the sound wave into the glass multiplied faster than the glass could contain it, and the glass gave way. That is resonance, and it is not a curiosity or a trick. It is one of the most fundamental and far-reaching principles in the physical universe. Every object has a frequency, sometimes called its natural frequency, and sometimes its resonant frequency, at which it wants to vibrate. Hit a tuning fork and it rings at its natural frequency every time. Pluck a guitar string and it vibrates at the frequency determined by its length and its tension. Tap a crystal bowl and it sings its specific note. These are not arbitrary. They are built into the physical structure of the object itself, determined by its size, its shape, its mass, its material. And when a sound wave arrives at an object carrying energy at that same frequency, something extraordinary happens. The vibrations do not simply add, they build. Each arriving wave adds to the movement already present, and the effect grows and grows and grows until either the source of the sound stops or the object reaches its limit. Now think about water. Pour some into a flat container and hold a speaker underneath it, feeding it a single, sustained tone. At certain frequencies, the water surface will do something deeply strange. It will organize. The random surface ripples will resolve into a geometric pattern, a grid, a flower, a mandala, precise and symmetrical and oddly beautiful. Change the frequency and the pattern changes. Increase the frequency and the pattern becomes more complex. The water is not being manipulated by any visible force. It is simply responding to the invisible structure of the sound wave passing through it, resolving its own movement into the shape that the frequency demands. This is not magic, it is physics, but it begins to suggest something that most people have never considered, that sound at the right frequency and in the right space does not just fill the air, it organizes matter. It imposes patterns. And when the matter in question is not water, when it is, for example, the soft tissue of a human organ, or the fluid inside a human inner ear, or the complex electrochemical environment of a human nervous system, the effects are not merely aesthetic. They are physiological, they are real. Here is the part that matters for everything that follows. The human body is not a single object with a single resonant frequency. It is a collection of objects, bones, organs, fluid-filled chambers, gas-filled cavities, each of which has its own resonant frequency, its own preferred vibration. The skull, for example, resonates at approximately 111 Hz. The chest cavity resonates at a somewhat lower frequency. The eyeball, as one physicist discovered in a deeply uncomfortable experiment, resonates at around 18 Hz. When a sound environment contains these frequencies at sufficient intensity, the corresponding structures in the body begin to vibrate. The effect is not imagined. It is not psychological. It is as mechanical as the wine glass shattering on the stage. And the builders of the great medieval cathedrals, those anonymous masters of the lodge, those nameless inheritors of knowledge, far older than Christianity, appear to have known this, not in the language of physics, not in the terminology of frequency and resonance that we use today, but in the language of proportion, of geometry, of inherited practice, of carefully transmitted experience. They knew what happened to people inside certain kinds of rooms, and they knew what specific shapes and specific sizes did to the human body and the human mind. And they built those shapes, those sizes, those specific ratios of space and stone into the most ambitious and most attended buildings their civilization ever produced. The story of how they knew and what exactly they built and what it has been quietly doing to the people inside for 9 centuries. That is the story we are telling. The entrance to the king's chamber, deep inside the Great Pyramid of Giza, is low and narrow and forces you to bend. This is not accidental. Nothing in the pyramid is accidental, as several generations of scholars have laboriously demonstrated. But the reason for the low ceiling at this specific point remains, like so much about the structure, a matter of careful debate. What is not debated, because it has been measured repeatedly and consistently, is what happens to sound once you are inside. The King's Chamber is a room approximately 10 meters long, 5 meters wide, and 5.5 meters high, cut from granite so dense and so precisely fitted that a playing card cannot be slid between its joints. When you stand in that room and make a sound, any sound, even a quiet one, the room holds it, not in the way that any stone room holds sound, amplifying and echoing it. The King's Chamber does something more specific than that. It takes the sound you make and it returns to you a resonance at approximately 111 hertz. That frequency the room seems to prefer above all others. That is the frequency at which the chamber resonates most powerfully, most completely, most insistently. And 111 hertz is the resonant frequency of the human skull. Whether this correspondence is intentional or extraordinary coincidence has been argued with great heat and rather less light for several decades. And what is not arguable is that the builders of the pyramid were not naive about the acoustic behavior of enclosed stone spaces. The evidence that ancient Egyptians understood resonance and used it deliberately in ceremonial contexts is not limited to the pyramid. It appears in temple construction across the Nile Valley, in chambers designed to amplify the voice of the priest, in ritual spaces whose dimensions appear to have been calculated to produce specific harmonic effects, and in stone corridors designed to create echoes at specific intervals that would have been experienced as a voice returning from the walls. The acoustic archaeologist Paul Devereux spent years documenting similar phenomena at megalithic sites across Britain and Ireland. At Campster Round in Scotland, at Wayland's Smithy in Oxfordshire, at site after site where prehistoric people had gone to enormous effort to construct enclosed stone chambers, Devereux and his colleagues found the same pattern. The chambers were built to produce specific, consistent, non-accidental acoustic effects, standing waves, sustained resonance, the doubling and multiplication of a single voice into something that filled the space completely and seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than from any human throat. These were not accidents of construction, so the megalithic builders understood something about the relationship between enclosed stone space and sound, understood it well enough to engineer it deliberately across thousands of years, across dozens of sites, across geographical distances, too great for any single tradition to account for. They knew that certain shapes made sound behave in certain ways. They knew that a person inside a space, vibrating at certain frequencies, was changed by the experience. And they built those spaces at enormous cost in labor and time and organizational complexity for the people who would use them. The oldest human-built structures in the world may not have been tombs. They may have been instruments. The dead inside them were perhaps secondary to the sound. And what the sound was doing to the living, to the priests, the initiates, as the worshippers who entered these chambers and sang into the resonant stone was something that the builders considered important enough to be worth moving mountains of rock to achieve. That understanding, embodied, practical, transmitted through direct experience across hundreds of generations, was the foundation on which, thousands of years later, the master builders of medieval Europe would raise their cathedrals. Travel south and east from the great stone circles of prehistoric Britain, and you arrive several thousand years later in the olive-covered hills of the Peloponnese, where the ancient Greeks built something that continues to astonish every acoustic engineer who has ever stood at its center and spoken a word. The theatre of Epidaurus was completed around 340 BCE, and it seats 14,000 people in a semicircular arrangement of stone tiers rising steeply from a circular orchestra at the bottom. A performer standing in the center of that orchestra, speaking at a normal conversational volume, can be heard with complete clarity by every person in every seat, in the back row, at the outermost edge, 100 meters away. No electronic amplification, no reflecting surfaces positioned to redirect the sound. Just a circle of stone and a hillside and geometry and a perfection of acoustic design that modern engineers, with all their tools, have spent decades trying to understand and have still not fully succeeded in replicating. At what makes the theatre work? The answer, when acoustic researchers finally mapped it in the 1990s, turned out to be a combination of factors so precisely coordinated that the idea of accidental perfection becomes almost impossible to maintain. The limestone seating acts as a natural filter, absorbing low-frequency background noise, the wind, the ambient sounds of the surrounding landscape, while allowing mid-frequency speech to pass through cleanly. The geometry of the semicircle focuses sound waves from the orchestra into the seating area with a directionality that no flat-fronted theatre can match. The slight upward angle of the tiers means that each row of seats is, in effect, positioned to receive sound that has already been rejected by the row in front. So the signal arrives at each level fresh, undamped, clear. The whole system works as if it had been designed by someone with an intuitive grasp of wave behavior that no theory available in 340 BCE should have been able to provide. Unless there was a theory, unless there was a tradition of knowledge, older than the Epidaurus theatre, and deeper than anything in the surviving written record, that understood what sound does when given the right shape to work with. Enter Pythagoras. Not the Pythagoras of your school geometry class, the triangle, seeing the squares, the neat proof written in chalk. The other Pythagoras, the one who spent years in Egypt and in Babylon, who returned to southern Italy with knowledge he refused to write down and transmitted only to the inner circle of a school so secretive that its members reportedly swore never to reveal its teachings on pain of death. The Pythagoras who believed, and here is where things become strange and interesting, that the universe was made of numbers, and that numbers, at their deepest level, express themselves as musical ratios. He was not speaking metaphorically. He had identified, through what combination of original observation and transmitted tradition we cannot say, the mathematical relationships that govern harmony in sound. the octave as a ratio of 2 to 1, the fifth as 3 to 2, the fourth as 4 to 3. These were not descriptions of music. They were, in his view, the underlying structure of reality, the proportions according to which the planets moved, and the patterns in which plants grew, the shapes in which sacred space should be built. Here is the line that matters. The harmonic ratios that Pythagoras described in the 6th century BCE are the same ratios encoded in the proportions of Gothic cathedrals, built 18 centuries later. The width to length, the length to height, the bay-to-bay relationships that appear consistently across the great buildings of medieval France and England. They are Pythagorean ratios. They are harmonic intervals expressed in stone. The knowledge did not spring up independently. It did not appear by coincidence. It travelled through Rome, through the Islamic world, through the hands of architects and builders who knew what they had inherited, even if they expressed it in the language of Christian theology rather than Greek philosophy. The theatre at Epidaurus is still standing. Stand at its centre and whisper, and 14,000 empty seats will hear you. The geometry works exactly as it always has. The knowledge built into it has never gone anywhere. It has simply been waiting to be understood. Between the philosopher Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE and the master builders who began raising Gothic cathedrals in 12th century France, more than 1,700 years elapsed. Empires rose and collapsed. Libraries burned. Languages died. And yet the knowledge of harmonic proportion, of the relationship between geometric ratio and acoustic behavior, arrived at the building sites of medieval Europe essentially intact, carried there by 3 distinct threads of transmission, each of which can be traced, at least in outline, through the surviving record. The first thread runs through Rome, when Roman engineers built their bathhouses and basilicas, their amphitheatres and senate chambers. They were working within an architectural tradition that had absorbed Greek harmonic theory and translated it into systematic, practical application. The most eloquent evidence of this is the work of Marcus Vitruvius, a Roman architect writing in the 1st century BCE, whose 10-volume treatise on architecture devotes an entire section to the placement of resonating bronze vessels inside theatres. These vessels, Vitruvius is precise about their sizing and their positioning, were designed to amplify the human voice by resonating in harmony with it. He describes the harmonic series they should be tuned to, the mathematical ratios governing their dimensions, and the specific locations within the theatre structure where they would have the greatest effect. This is not intuitive folk knowledge. This is systematic acoustic engineering, expressed in mathematical language, committed to writing and transmitted to posterity. That text survived. It survived the collapse of Rome, the migrations, the centuries that have been called dark, largely because we are still learning to read them, and it was translated into Latin during the High Middle Ages, precisely as the first Gothic cathedrals were beginning to be planned. The second thread runs through the Islamic world. While Western Europe was rebuilding from the rubble of the Western Roman Empire, Islamic scholars in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Toledo, and Cairo were preserving, translating, extending, and in many cases improving the entire corpus of Greek and Roman natural philosophy. The works of Aristotle, of Euclid, of Pythagoras, of the Neoplatonist philosophers who had synthesized Greek rationalism with older mystical traditions. All of this was maintained in Arabic translation, annotated, debated, and developed. The school of Toledo in Spain, where European scholars in the 12th century began the systematic translation of Arabic manuscripts back into Latin, was the single most important conduit through which this body of knowledge re-entered European intellectual culture. It is not a coincidence that the first Gothic cathedral was begun at Saint-Denis, near Paris in 1140, within a generation of Toledo's translation movement reaching its height. The third thread is less documented, more debated, and considerably more intriguing. The Knights Templar, founded in 1119 to protect Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, spent decades in Jerusalem and across the Middle East, in intimate contact with Islamic scholars, Jewish Kabbalists, and practitioners of traditions that stretched back centuries before Christianity. When they returned to Europe, wealthy, powerful, and carrying knowledge that their contemporaries found both impressive and unsettling, they became major commissioners and funders of early Gothic architecture. The geometric sophistication of early Gothic buildings in regions under Templar influence has been noted by architectural historians and largely set aside. But the pattern is there, in stone, in building after building, a consistency of proportion, a specificity of acoustic calculation that goes beyond anything that can be explained by the simple transmission of structural knowledge. The acoustic sophistication of Gothic cathedrals was not invented in the 12th century. It was assembled, gathered from ancient fragments, translated, adapted, and applied by people who understood enough of what they were working with to use it with extraordinary skill. They were building on a foundation laid by others who had been building on a foundation laid by others still, reaching back so far into human prehistory that the beginning of the tradition is lost in stone and silence. To understand what the shift to Gothic architecture meant acoustically, and you need to spend a few minutes inside a Romanesque church first. They are not difficult to find in Europe. The older, lower, heavier buildings that predate the Gothic Revolution, their round arches pressing down on thick walls, their small windows admitting narrow bars of light, their interiors solid and dark, and above all, quiet. Step inside one of these buildings and make a sound. The building takes it, flattens it, absorbs it into the stone almost immediately. The walls are too thick and too irregular, too close to act as reflectors. The ceiling is too low to allow reverberation to build. The sound dies quickly and the silence returns. The Romanesque church is acoustically a room, a very large room, but a room nonetheless. It does not sing. Now step into a Gothic cathedral built 100 years later in the same city. The walls are thinner, the structural load has been moved outside the building, are distributed through the flying buttresses that lean against it from the exterior like stone wings. The windows that these thinner walls permit are vast, not slits admitting candlelight, but entire walls of glass admitting the entire spectrum of daylight. The ceiling, freed from the need to be supported by the walls beneath it, climbs. 40 meters, 50, 60, in the most ambitious examples. And the interior, the long, high, stone-vaulted nave, is suddenly not a room at all, and it is something closer to a musical instrument. The pointed arch was the structural key to all of this, and it changed the acoustic behavior of the building in ways that were not coincidental. A semicircular Romanesque arch distributes its load outward, requiring thick walls to contain it. A pointed Gothic arch distributes its load more directly downward, reducing the outward thrust and allowing the walls to be lightened. But the pointed arch also does something to sound that the semicircular arch does not. Its geometry focuses the reflection of sound waves more precisely, directing them upward and inward toward the center of the vault, rather than scattering them in multiple directions simultaneously. The ribbed vault, a specifically Gothic innovation, addressed a different acoustic problem. In a plain barrel-vaulted ceiling, a smooth, curved surface running the length of the nave, certain frequencies would have bounced back and forth between the vault and the floor in a regular pattern, creating standing waves, positions in the room where sound built to an intense peak, and positions where it was almost entirely cancelled. The ribbed vault, with its irregular, complex geometry of stone ribs intersecting at different angles, scattered these reflections in dozens of directions simultaneously, breaking up the standing wave pattern and distributing sound more evenly throughout the space. And then the flying buttress. By carrying the structural load of the roof and the upper walls out and away from the building on external stone arms, the flying buttress freed the interior walls from their load-bearing function entirely. Those walls could now be opened up, filled with glass, interrupted with chapels, broken with niches and doorways, and the entire interior became a single, unified, resonating chamber, rather than a series of separate rooms divided by thick stone partitions. What the Gothic architects had created, whether they understood it in these terms or in terms that meant something completely different to them, was a space designed to let sound live. The Romanesque church silenced sound. The Gothic cathedral amplified it, enriched it, and returned it to the people inside, transformed. In the winter of 1991, restoration workers cutting into a wall cavity inside a 12th century church in northern France encountered something that stopped the work for several days, while specialists were called in to assess what had been found. Sealed inside the cavity at precise intervals, oriented at specific angles, were ceramic vessels, dozens of them, each one roughly the size and shape of a large jug, sealed at the mouth, here positioned so that its opening faced a specific direction within the wall. They were intact. They had been there since the building was constructed, and for the first several days after their discovery, no one could say what they were for. An acoustic engineer arrived, measured the dimensions of the vessels, calculated their resonant frequencies, and placed them in the context of the building's known acoustic properties. The vessels were tuned, specifically tuned, to frequencies corresponding to the harmonics most prominent in the nave's natural resonance. They were not storage containers, not ritual objects in any religious sense, not structural elements. They were, as the engineer's report concluded, resonating chambers, designed to reinforce specific frequencies within the building's overall sound field and to absorb others. They were, in the most literal possible sense, part of the building's acoustic design. And similar vessels have been found in medieval churches across France, Belgium, Scandinavia, and Denmark, always embedded in walls or floors, always positioned at precise intervals, always tuned to the resonant characteristics of the specific building in which they are found. Their dimensions correspond closely to the bronze resonating vessels described by Vitruvius in his 1st century treatise on theatre acoustics. The medieval builders knew that text. They were applying its principles. But the vessels are only the most tangible evidence of a broader pattern of deliberate acoustic design that is visible once you know what you are looking for in almost every Gothic cathedral in Europe. Consider the corbel tables, the rows of carved stone brackets that run along the exterior and interior walls at regular intervals, their projecting forms breaking up what would otherwise be flat, reflective surfaces. In acoustic engineers studying these features have consistently found that they serve the same function as the diffuser panels installed in modern recording studios and concert halls. They scatter sound reflections, preventing the build-up of disruptive echoes and creating a more even, more spacious, more acoustically complex sound field throughout the interior. Consider the placement of the side chapels. In almost every major Gothic cathedral, the side aisles contain rows of chapels, in each one an enclosed space with its own acoustic character, each one opening into the main nave through an arch. These chapels act as Helmholtz resonators, acoustic devices that absorb specific frequencies selectively, removing unwanted, low-frequency build-up from the nave, while leaving the desirable mid-frequency resonance intact. The design principle is identical to the bass trap resonators installed in recording studios. In Gothic cathedrals, it is built into the stone. Consider the screen, the carved stone or wood partition that separates the choir from the nave in most medieval cathedrals. Modern acoustic analysis has shown that the screen acts as a mid-frequency diffuser, breaking up the sound coming from the choir before it enters the nave and distributing it more evenly throughout the main space. Remove the screen, as happened in many English cathedrals during the Victorian period, in the name of opening up the view and the interior, and the acoustic character of the building changes significantly. The choir becomes drier, more direct. The nave loses a layer of richness. The building sounds different because the screen was not decoration, it was part of the instrument. And then there is the orientation. The great majority of Gothic cathedrals are oriented along a precise east-west axis, with the altar at the east end and the main entrance at the west. And this is usually explained as a requirement of Christian liturgy, the altar facing the rising sun toward Jerusalem, toward the direction of divine light. But there is another consequence of this orientation that has received considerably less theological attention. In Western Europe, the prevailing winds blow from the southwest. A building oriented east-west, with its long, solid walls facing north and south, presents those winds with its narrowest face. The noise of the wind, which at low frequencies is virtually identical to the infrasound frequencies produced inside the building is deflected away from the main body of the structure. The interior remains quiet. The acoustic environment the builders had so carefully constructed was protected from the one natural force that could most readily have disrupted it. Every one of these features has a theological explanation. Every one of them also has a precise acoustic function. The builders, it appears, were not choosing between the two. They were building both at the same time. Take the ground plan of Chartres Cathedral and measure it carefully, the width of the nave, the total width including the side aisles, the length from the west facade to the east end of the choir, the height of the vault above the nave floor. Write these numbers down and then look at the relationships between them. What you will find, what architectural scholars have been cataloguing for more than a century, and what acoustic researchers have more recently provided a completely new framework for understanding, is that these numbers are not independent of each other. They are related. Specifically, they are related in the same way that notes in a musical scale are related to each other by simple ratios, by the harmonic proportions that Pythagoras described as the fundamental structure of the universe. The width of the Chartres nave to its height is approximately 1 to 2, an octave in the total width of the nave and aisles to the length of the building is close to 1 to 3, a twelfth. The dimensions of the individual bays relate to each other by the ratio 2 to 3, a musical fifth. These relationships are not approximate coincidences. They appear throughout the building at multiple scales, from the proportions of the whole down to the dimensions of individual windows and the spacing of columns. And this is what medieval builders and theorists called sacred geometry, the encoding of divine mathematical order into the physical dimensions of sacred space. They believed, following a tradition that ran through Pythagoras, through Plato's Timaeus, through the Neoplatonist philosophers, and into medieval Christian thought, that the universe was built according to harmonic mathematical ratios, and that a building constructed according to those same ratios was in alignment with the order of creation, was in some sense that they took entirely seriously a physical embodiment of divine proportion. What acoustic science has added to this theological understanding is a mechanism, a physical explanation for why the harmonic ratios should be used in building design that has nothing to do with theology and everything to do with the behavior of sound waves in enclosed spaces. Here is the principle. When the dimensions of a room are related by simple integer ratios, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, the frequencies that resonate most strongly inside that room are related by those same ratios. A room whose width and length are in the ratio 2 to 3 will produce its most powerful resonances at frequencies in the ratio 2 to 3, which is to say, at frequencies in the relationship of a musical fifth. A room whose dimensions are Pythagorean harmonic ratios will, acoustically, prefer Pythagorean harmonic frequencies. The resonances of Chartres Cathedral are, by this logic, harmonic. The frequencies the building amplifies, the notes it returns when sound is made inside it, the acoustic signature it imposes on everything that happens within its walls. These are musically consonant frequencies related to each other by the same proportions as the notes of a major chord. The building is not just shaped like music, it resonates like music. Now it returns music to the people inside it, amplified and enriched by its own geometry. Now take this one step further. The golden ratio, approximately 1 to 1.618, appears repeatedly in Gothic cathedral proportions, in the heights of windows relative to their widths, in the proportions of towers, in the spacing of ornamental elements. Unlike the simple integer ratios, the golden ratio cannot be expressed as a fraction of two whole numbers. It is irrational in the mathematical sense, endless in non-repeating, never quite resolved. And acoustically, a room whose dimensions incorporate the golden ratio produces a resonance that is richer, more complex, more unpredictable than a room built on simple integer ratios. The frequencies pile up in patterns that do not repeat, that do not resolve into a single dominant note, that continue to unfold and interact as long as sound is present. Modern acoustic researchers studying such spaces have described the effect as uniquely stimulating to the human nervous system, activating rather than sedating, opening rather than closing. The builders of Chartres used both simple harmonic ratios for the major structural dimensions, providing the consonant acoustic foundation, golden ratio proportions for the details, providing the complexity and depth that prevents the acoustic environment from ever becoming entirely predictable, entirely resolved, entirely still. They were building an acoustic environment that was simultaneously harmonious and inexhaustible, an environment in which the human ear and the human nervous system would find perpetual, gentle stimulation rather than the blank repetition of a single, resonant note. They were building this not in theory, but in stone, working from geometric instruments and inherited ratios. They did not have equations, and they had something older than equations, a practical wisdom about the relationship between shape and sound that had been tested and refined across thousands of years of building sacred space. Almost everyone has experienced it, in one building or another. You step through a great doorway and something that was operating at full speed inside you. The running commentary, the planning, the worry, and the continuous self-referential chatter that constitutes the normal texture of waking thought goes quiet. Not because you decide to quiet it, not because anything has told you to stop thinking. It happens before you are aware it is happening, and by the time you notice, the silence inside is already several seconds old. Something has changed in the body too. The shoulders have dropped. The breath has slowed. The eyes, instead of their usual rapid scanning, have opened wide and become still, taking in the whole of the space rather than any single part of it. You feel, without being able to say precisely why, that something large and quiet is present in the room with you. Not a person, not a threat. Something that does not have a name in the normal vocabulary of experience. Psychologists Daché, Keltner, and Jonathan Haidt have studied this state extensively, and they call it awe. Their research describes it as a distinct emotional and physiological condition, or triggered by encounters with vastness, physical, conceptual, or temporal, that challenge the mind's existing categories for understanding the world. Or they have found produces measurable changes in the body: reduced heart rate, slowed respiration, decreased activity in the brain regions associated with self-focused thought. It also produces, in the longer term, increased generosity, increased willingness to cooperate with strangers, reduced feelings of personal entitlement. The experience of awe, in other words, makes people more open and less self-centered. It is not merely pleasant, it is, the research suggests, in some sense necessary, a psychological maintenance function that the human nervous system appears to need access to periodically, and that it pursues through the search for experiences of scale, of beauty, and of the transcendent. The cathedral delivers all of these simultaneously. The visual scale, the height of the vault, the length of the nave, at the sweep of the stone arch, is larger than almost anything else a medieval person would have encountered in their daily life, and is still impressive to people who live in cities full of tall buildings. The colored light of the stained glass windows, filtering the outside world into something richer and stranger than ordinary daylight, creates a visual environment with no equivalent in nature. The spatial complexity, the layered spaces of nave and aisle and choir and chapel, the way the eye is continually drawn forward and upward and sideways by arches opening into further depths, engages the mind with a constant gentle challenge to map a space that keeps revealing new dimensions. But the acoustic dimension is different from all of these, and the research suggests it may be the most powerful. The reverberant sound field of a great cathedral is unlike any natural acoustic environment that the human nervous system has been designed to process. It is richer than a cave, richer in frequency content, richer in temporal complexity. It is more sustained than any sound the human body produces. No voice, no heartbeat, no breath holds a note for 7 seconds. It envelops the listener completely, arriving from all directions simultaneously, filling not just the ears but the entire surface of the body with pressure waves that cannot be localized or escaped. And the term for this condition is acoustic immersion, the point at which a sound environment becomes so complete, so enveloping, so unescapable that it begins to influence perception directly, altering the balance between what the brain receives from its external senses and what it generates from its own internal processes. The cathedral was designed to reach that point, not accidentally, not as a side effect of its structural requirements or its theological symbolism. It was designed to produce, in the people who entered it, a specific and reliable transformation of inner experience. The builders knew what they were building. They had inherited a tradition old enough to have tested it. There is a sound inside every great cathedral that you will never consciously hear. It is below the range of the human ear, below the threshold of approximately 20 hertz, below which individual cycles of air pressure become too slow to register as a distinct sensation of pitch. And yet it is there, some vibrating the air and the stone and everything in between, with a persistence and an intensity that makes the audible music of the building, in some sense, merely the decoration on a much larger and much older acoustic event. It is called infrasound, and the list of its documented effects on the human body is one of the stranger catalogues in experimental physiology. At the right intensities and frequencies, infrasound, sound below the threshold of conscious hearing, produces disorientation, a pervasive sense of unease, feelings of a presence in the room, visual disturbances at the periphery of vision, sudden and inexplicable emotional shifts including tears, and a persistent, sourceless sense of awe or dread that cannot be attributed to anything in the visible environment. None of these effects require the person to believe in anything. They are purely mechanical. The sound waves are moving matter that would prefer not to be moved, and the matter in question is inside a human body. And the physicist Vic Tandy provided the most controlled demonstration of this in the 1990s, when he noticed that the members of his laboratory team were experiencing a cluster of unusual symptoms: unease, peripheral, visual disturbances, a general sense of being watched in a specific room that had recently been given a new ventilation system. Tandy measured the room and found a standing wave at approximately 19 hertz, generated by the resonant frequency of the new fan. When the fan was modified and the symptoms ceased, the hauntedness of the room, its quality of uncanny, sourceless menace, vanished along with the infrasound. He published his findings. The implications were extensive and somewhat uncomfortable, and they have been discussed in various contexts ever since. Now consider the great pipe organs installed in Gothic cathedrals. The largest pipes in a cathedral organ, the 32-foot wooden pipes that produce the lowest notes of the pedal division, generate their fundamental frequency at approximately 16 hertz, below the threshold of hearing. The note you perceive when that pipe speaks is not the fundamental, it is the harmonics, the overtones at 32 hertz and 48 hertz and beyond, which are within the audible range. But the fundamental frequency, the 16 hertz bass tone, is present in the air. It is vibrating the floor you stand on, and the walls around you, the stone vault above your head, and the soft tissue of your body. You do not hear it, you are inside it. The proportions of the Gothic nave, that long, high, stone-vaulted, resonating chamber, whose dimensions we now understand were carefully calculated, act to amplify those low-frequency components rather than dampen them. The building is sized in part to resonate in sympathy with the lowest output of its organ. The way a guitar body is sized to resonate in sympathy with its strings. The physical dimensions of the nave determine the frequencies at which the building itself will vibrate most strongly. And those frequencies in the great Gothic cathedrals correspond to the infrasonic output of the instruments built to play inside them. Whether the builders of the 12th century understood this in terms of frequency and resonance, or whether they understood it in terms of geometry and proportion and inherited practice, whether they knew what they were building in the language of physics or in the language of transmitted acoustic wisdom, is a question we cannot answer definitively. What we can say is that the correspondence is not accidental, and that the effect it produces in the bodies of the people standing inside the building while the organ sounds is exactly the effect most commonly described in the historical accounts of religious experience inside these buildings. The awe without cause, the tears without grief, the sense of presence in the air that no one can identify or locate, the feeling that the room itself is alive. The most powerful note the building plays is not written in any hymn book, and no one told the congregation it was playing, and it has been playing every time the organ sounds for 900 years. Imagine you are a Benedictine monk in the 10th century, responsible for composing a sequence of music to accompany the Mass. You have never heard the word acoustics. You have no equipment for measuring the behavior of sound waves. What you do have is a lifetime of experience singing inside stone buildings, a tradition of musical practice transmitted through direct teaching by masters who had themselves sung inside stone buildings their whole lives, and a profound embodied understanding of what happened to sound and to the singers producing it, when specific kinds of music were made inside specific kinds of spaces. You know, because you have felt it hundreds of times, so that a melody with fast-moving notes becomes muddy inside a stone vault. The previous note is still reverberating when the next arrives, and the two overlap and obscure each other. So you compose slowly. You give each note space to breathe, to develop, to travel through the building and return before you move to the next. You know that consonants, hard sounds, percussive sounds, the T and the K and the P of spoken Latin, clutter a reverberant space with noise, while vowels, open sounds, are sustained and shapeable. Allow the reverberation to build around them into something richer than the voice alone could produce. So you emphasize the vowel, you sustain it. You let the building fill with it before you move to the next syllable. This is Gregorian chant, and every one of its distinctive features, the slow tempo, the single sustained melodic line, the emphasis on open vowels, the use of modal scales that favor simple harmonic intervals, the absence of rhythmic complexity, the dynamic restraint that never rises to the kind of intensity that would overload a reverberant space. Every one of these features is acoustically optimal for a building with 5 to 8 seconds of reverberation. Modern musicologists and acoustic engineers who have analyzed the relationship have been consistently struck by how precise the correspondence is. Gregorian chant is not music that happens to work well in cathedrals. It is music that was developed, refined, and notated specifically for the acoustic environment that cathedrals provide by people who had spent their entire professional lives inside those buildings and who knew, through long experience, exactly what that environment demanded. There is also the matter of pitch. Medieval chant was notated and performed at a pitch standard that corresponds to approximately A equals 432 Hz, slightly lower than the modern concert standard of A equals 440 Hz, which was not universally adopted until the 20th century. The claims made for the 432 Hz standard range from the scientifically documented to the speculative, and care is required in distinguishing between them. What is documented is this. At 432 Hz, the harmonic series of the note A produces overtones that align more cleanly with the natural resonant frequencies of many stone spaces, including the principal resonances of the Gothic nave, than the overtones produced at 440 Hz. Whether the medieval musicians knew this in those terms is impossible to say. What they knew, in practice, was that their music sounded right, fuller, more resonant, more completely integrated with the space, at this pitch. The chant and the building were not separate things, developed independently, and then brought together by convenience. They were two aspects of a single acoustic system. The music optimized for the space amplifying the qualities of the music. The combined experience of the two creating something in the people inside that neither could have created alone. The monks who sang the chant were singing for the stone as much as for God. They were playing the building the way a musician plays an instrument, drawing from it harmonics and resonances that existed only in the potential of its proportions, actualizing through their voices the acoustic intention of the men who had shaped the stone around them. The building was waiting. The music completed it. Think about what it meant to enter a great cathedral in the 12th century. You came from a world of mud and noise and physical labor and the permanent grinding anxiety of a medieval life measured in bad harvests and disease and early death. You came from a dwelling, if you were lucky, with a single room, a dirt floor, a smoke hole in the roof, and acoustics determined entirely by proximity and accident. The sounds of your daily life were the sounds of animals, of tools, of children, of neighbors too close, of weather too loud. There was no quiet. There was no beauty of sound that was not incidental. And then you stepped through the west door of the cathedral. The noise stopped, not gradually, immediately, as the massive stone walls cut the exterior world off, with a completeness that no structure you had ever entered had approached. The light changed, from the flat grey of a northern sky to something filtered and coloured and sacred, stained glass, turning ordinary daylight into the imagined colours of paradise. The smell changed, incense, beeswax candles, the faint mineral scent of damp stone. And the sound changed, opened into something so different from everything you had experienced outside that your body registered it before your mind could process it. The Catholic Church, in the medieval period, was the most sophisticated manager of human sensory experience in the world. Its theologians, its architects, its liturgists, these were people who understood with a clarity that modern secular culture has largely lost, that human beings are not primarily rational creatures who process information and reach conclusions. They are primarily sensory creatures who have experiences and then construct reasons for what they felt. Control the experience, and you go a long way toward controlling the conclusion. This is not cynicism. It is simply a recognition of something the Church understood and acted upon with extraordinary thoroughness. The light was designed to produce awe. The coloured glass, the arrangement of windows to illuminate specific parts of the building at specific moments of the liturgical day, the darkness of the nave, contrasted with the luminous choir. The incense was designed to produce altered consciousness, frankincense specifically, and contains compounds that modern pharmacology has confirmed have mild psychoactive effects at the concentrations produced by cathedral censers. The posture of kneeling on stone for extended periods produces specific physiological effects. Reduced blood pressure, an increase in the tendency toward interior experience, a degree of physical discomfort that focuses attention inward. And the sound, and the Church held councils in the 9th century specifically to regulate the emotional and psychological effect of ecclesiastical music. The Carolingian synods debated with considerable intensity which modes of musical expression were appropriate for the liturgy, not because some modes were theologically incorrect, but because some modes produced effects in the congregation that the Church considered excessive or destabilizing or insufficiently aligned with the emotional states it wished to cultivate. These were aesthetic discussions, yes, but they were aesthetic discussions conducted by people who understood music as a technology for managing human inner experience, not merely as an art form. If the Church was sophisticated enough to regulate the emotional effect of music through legislation, it was sophisticated enough to consider the acoustic environment of its buildings as part of that regulation. The reverberant stone nave, the organ's low frequencies, the chant designed for that specific space, none of these were incidental. They were the instruments of an acoustic authority that understood, at a level of practical precision, that the modern world is only beginning to recover what sound does to the people it surrounds. Hildegard of Bingen was a 12th century Benedictine abbess, a composer, a natural philosopher, a medical writer, and one of the most prolific visionary mystics in the history of Western Christianity. From childhood, she experienced what she described as a living light, a luminous field at the edge of her vision that she could not look at directly, but which accompanied her with a steady brightness that was different from ordinary sight. When this light intensified, particularly during prayer and the sung liturgy, visions came with it. Complex, detailed, and allegorical scenes whose theological content she transcribed with great care and which fill several large volumes. She described the onset of these visions as arriving with sound, a sound she called the living voice of light, a vast sustained tone, something she compared to a river or a wind that preceded and accompanied the visual experience. Modern acoustic researchers who have measured the resonant conditions of the Benedictine Abbey Church at Rupertsberg, where Hildegard lived and worked, have found standing waves in the frequency range between 100 Hz and 120 Hz, precisely the range most commonly associated with auditory hallucination and with the perception of externally sourced sounds that have no identifiable physical cause. Saint Teresa of Avila, writing in 16th century Spain, described her ecstatic states with a precision and a frankness that gave her contemporaries both awe and significant anxiety. She was careful to distinguish between different grades of mystical experience, and the highest of them, the transverberation, the moment of union, was typically preceded by an extended period during which she had been deeply immersed in the sung divine office. Now she described the transition between ordinary consciousness and the ecstatic state as passing through something, a threshold, a membrane, and on the other side, the ordinary faculties of thought and self-awareness were suspended. She was clear that she considered this a gift of grace, not a product of her own effort. She was clear that it left her physically changed and lasting days. What modern researchers bring to these accounts is not debunking, but context, an understanding of the specific physiological conditions that accompany extended immersion in a reverberant acoustic environment, combined with kneeling on stone, exposure to frankincense smoke at sustained concentrations, visual fixation on candlelight, fasting, and sleep deprivation typical of monastic schedules. Each of these conditions, in isolation, is associated with altered states of perception. The research literature on sensory manipulation and altered consciousness is extensive on this point. Combined, as they were combined in the daily experience of medieval religious life, they constitute something considerably more powerful than any single factor alone. The question this raises, and it is a question worth sitting with rather than rushing to answer, is whether this context diminishes what Hildegard and Teresa experienced. Whether knowing the physiological mechanisms that supported their visions makes those visions less real, less valuable, less true in any sense that matters. The answer, which the research itself does not provide, depends entirely on what you think reality is made of, and where experience fits within it. What the research does provide is this: the acoustic environment of the Gothic cathedral was not incidental to the mystical experiences reported inside it. It was a contributing condition. The building was doing something to the people inside it. The people inside it were having experiences that would otherwise have been inaccessible to them. The church built these buildings knowing this. The builders who designed these buildings had inherited a tradition that knew this. The monks who composed the music knew this in their bones, if not in any theoretical framework. The experience of divine presence that filled the historical record of medieval Christianity was not manufactured, but it was supported, facilitated, amplified by a physical environment that had been designed with extraordinary skill to make it available. The boundary between engineering and theology, between physics and faith, was for these builders not a boundary at all. It was the space they worked in. There is an experiment, simple enough to run in any choir rehearsal, and remarkable enough that researchers have replicated it in controlled laboratory conditions with consistent results, in which participants are fitted with heart rate monitors before singing together. What the monitors show within minutes of communal singing beginning is that the heartbeats begin to synchronize, not approximately, measurably, consistently, to a degree that goes well beyond what chance would predict. The singers become cardiovascularly a single organism. Their autonomous nervous systems, without instruction or effort, begin to beat together. This is not a metaphor. It is a physiological fact about what happens to human bodies when they produce sustained sound together in an acoustically reflective environment. And it only begins to describe the changes that communal chanting produced inside a Gothic cathedral, where the reverberant sound field took hundreds of individual voices and merged them into something so acoustically unified that the individual contribution could not be distinguished from the whole. The biochemistry of this state is now reasonably well understood. Communal singing and chanting produces significant elevations in oxytocin, the neurochemical associated with trust, social bonding, and the reduction of interpersonal threat responses. Here it produces endorphin release comparable to moderate physical exercise. It synchronizes not just heart rate, but respiratory rhythms and, in sustained sessions, brainwave patterns among participants. The people who left a cathedral after a full mass were not the same people who had entered it. They were neurochemically and physiologically more bonded to each other, more trusting of each other, more willing to cooperate, more willing to sacrifice individual interest for collective benefit than they had been an hour before. The medieval church understood this effect, if not in the biochemical terms we use today. Its liturgical calendar was constructed around regular, obligatory, collective gatherings inside acoustically resonant spaces, precisely timed to the social moments: harvest, planting, birth, death, conflict, peace, when community cohesion was most needed. The binding effect of collective ritual sound was not an accidental benefit of liturgical practice. It was, at least in part, its purpose. Consider also the bells. Every medieval town of any size had at least one bell tower, and many had several, and the bells rang not just to call people to worship, but to mark the hours of the day, to announce births and deaths and marriages, to signal danger and celebration. The acoustic range of a church bell is enormous. A large bell can be heard clearly several miles away under good conditions, and the bells of a medieval town collectively defined its acoustic territory, establishing the sonic boundaries within which a community existed and beyond which it did not. You knew by the bells you could hear which community you belonged to. Your acoustic world and your social world were the same world. Sound in the medieval universe was not background, and it was structure. It defined identity, enforced obligation, established the rhythms of collective life, and that, inside the cathedrals, at the moments of the greatest communal gathering, it dissolved the boundaries between individual bodies and created, briefly, reliably, something that every member of the congregation could feel, but none of them could have produced alone. The cathedral was not a place where a community gathered to worship. It was the acoustic event, through which a community became a community, through which the sum of its individual members became something more than their total. The builders understood this. They built for it, and the buildings are still doing it. Every time the choir sings and the stone carries the sound forward, there is a spot on the floor of Chartres Cathedral, roughly in the centre of the nave, perhaps a third of the way along its length from the west door, where, if you stop and listen very carefully, you can hear the building thinking. This is not mysticism. It is the point at which the reflected sound from the west wall and the reflected sound from the choir converge with the reflected sound from the two side walls and the reflected sound from the vault above. And the four streams of energy meet with a coincidence of timing and angle that makes the air at that spot denser with sound than anywhere else in the building. If you stand there and sing a single note, gently, nothing loud, the building sings it back to you from all four directions at once. And what returns is not an echo, but a chord, a harmonic development of the original note that the stone has built from the architecture's own internal logic. Acoustic engineers who have spent time measuring Chartres have a specific term for this quality. Its reverberation time at mid-frequencies averages 5.5 seconds, long enough for the full harmonic development of a sustained note. short enough that the text of the chant, the Latin syllables moving slowly through the reverberant field, retains its intelligibility. The balance is exact, not approximate, exact. The vaulted ceiling contributes its ribbed geometry to scatter sound in dozens of directions simultaneously. The thick outer walls, constructed from limestone dense enough to absorb almost nothing below 500 Hz, act as a near-perfect mirror for the bass frequencies that give the building's resonance its characteristic depth and weight. The placement of the choir screen, that ornate carved partition separating the liturgical choir from the public nave, diffuses the mid-frequency energy coming from the east before it enters the main body of the building, spreading it more evenly and preventing the formation of a single dominant reflection from the flat face of the apse. And then there is the labyrinth, cut into the stone of the nave floor, roughly 11 meters in diameter. The Chartres labyrinth is the largest medieval labyrinth in existence, and one of the most geometrically precise objects in the building. Its spiral path, traced by pilgrims on their knees, follows proportional relationships that mirror the harmonic ratios encoded in the building's overall dimensions, seeing whether this geometric correspondence was intended to carry acoustic significance or was simply an expression of the same underlying mathematical philosophy, is a question that remains open. What is not open is the observation that the center of the labyrinth, the point of arrival at the end of its winding path, corresponds closely to the acoustic focal point of the nave. The most visually brilliant window in Chartres, the deep blue west rose, which filters the afternoon light into something almost unearthly, was produced by adding specific metallic oxides to the glass. These same compounds also make the glass particularly transparent to sound. Whether this was intended or not, the most beautiful feature of the building is also acoustically the most generous. The windows let in light and the walls give back sound, and together they produce an environment so completely designed that even the most resolutely secular visitor is rarely left entirely unaffected. 45 kilometres south of Edinburgh, in the village of Roslin, stands a building that has been the subject of more concentrated speculation per square metre than almost any other structure in Europe. Roslin Chapel was built in the 15th century by William Sinclair, the Earl of Orkney, and left unfinished at his death. Only the choir and part of the transept were completed, and the stone pillars at the east end still rise to support nothing, open to the sky. Its extraordinary density of carved decoration has attracted archaeologists, theologians, historians, and, after the publication of a certain enormously popular thriller in 2003, tourists by the millions. Almost everyone who visits is looking for something. Most of them are not looking at the ceiling. See, the ceiling of Roslin Chapel is covered in 213 carved stone cubes, each roughly the size of a large book, each face carved with a pattern in shallow relief. The patterns vary, some geometric, some floral, some apparently abstract. For 5 centuries, they were assumed to be decorative, an expression of the Sinclair family's taste for elaborate ornament, or perhaps a symbolic vocabulary whose meaning had been lost. Then a Scottish musician named Stuart Mitchell began to look at them differently. Mitchell had been studying the phenomenon of cymatics, the science of sound made visible, and he noticed that the patterns on the Roslin cubes bore a striking resemblance to the geometric figures produced when specific frequencies are applied to vibrating surfaces covered in sand or liquid. Each cymatic pattern corresponds to a specific frequency. If the cube carvings were cymatic patterns, they were a notation, a record of specific pitches, arranged in a sequence that could, in principle, be read as a musical composition. Mitchell spent years working with his musician father to decode the sequence. The resulting piece, which they called the Roslin Motus, was performed for the first time in the chapel in 2007. Whether Mitchell's reading is correct, whether the builders of Roslin Chapel truly encoded a musical composition in the ceiling using the patterns of cymatics, is something the academic community has approached with careful skepticism and continued curiosity. The cymatic interpretation requires that 15th century Scottish stonemasons had access to a knowledge of how specific frequencies produce specific geometric patterns in vibrating matter that was not formally documented in Western science until the 18th century. This is not impossible. It is, however, remarkable. What is not in question is what the chapel sounds like. Roslin's small interior, the choir is roughly 30 meters long and 12 wide, combined with its extraordinary density of carved surface, creates a sound field of unusual complexity and intimacy. There are no large flat surfaces to produce simple echoes. There is no single dominant reflection. Every note sung inside the chapel is surrounded immediately by a rich halo of diffuse sound, arriving from dozens of slightly different directions and slightly different times, creating an effect of acoustic depth that is quite different from the expansive resonance of the great Gothic cathedrals. Roslin does not fill you with sound, it wraps around you in it. Whether that effect was designed or discovered, it has been doing the same thing for 600 years. The nave of Salisbury Cathedral in Wiltshire, England, is the longest medieval nave in Britain. 143 metres of stone-vaulted interior, narrower than Chartres, lower than Amiens, but sustained through that extraordinary length with a precision of proportion that gives its acoustic behaviour a character entirely its own. Stand at the west end and clap your hands, a single sharp clap, and listen to what follows. The sound does not simply reverberate, it moves. You can hear it travelling east, down the length of the nave, and the echo following the clap in a rolling wave that takes a measurable fraction of a second to reach the far wall and a measurable fraction of a second to return. The effect is known as flutter echo, the audible manifestation of a sound wave bouncing between two parallel surfaces, and in most buildings it is an acoustic problem, something to be designed away. In Salisbury, the length of the nave is so precisely calibrated that the flutter echo arrives back at the west wall at a frequency corresponding to one of the building's natural resonant modes. The echo does not fight the building, it reinforces it. Acoustic journals have published analyses of Salisbury's dimensions, showing that the relationship between the length of the nave and the height of the vault corresponds to the relationship between the wavelength of the building's fundamental resonant frequency and its first harmonic. In other words, the building is proportioned in its major dimensions, like a pipe organ pipe tuned to its own natural note. The building has a pitch, not a metaphorical pitch, but a measurable one, a frequency at which its stone structure vibrates most readily and to which its acoustic environment is correspondingly most responsive. The great organ at Salisbury, when its lowest pipes are played, drives the building at something close to this frequency. The stone floor transmits the vibration to every person standing on it. The effect is not music exactly. It is closer to being inside music, being a part of the resonating structure rather than a listener outside it. Can cross the European continent, cross the Bosphorus, and stand inside Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and you find yourself inside what is possibly the most extraordinary acoustic space in human history. The church was completed in 537 CE by the Emperor Justinian and remained for nearly 1,000 years the largest enclosed space in the world. Its central dome, 55 meters in diameter, rising 56 meters above the floor, sits above a space so vast and so complexly articulated with half-domes, galleries, and colonnaded side aisles that measuring its acoustic properties requires not one set of measurements, but dozens, taken at different positions and averaged across all of them. The result is a reverberation time of between 7 and 11 seconds, varying with frequency and position. At low frequencies, in the center of the nave beneath the dome, the reverb approaches 11 seconds. This is longer than most people have ever experienced in any enclosed space. A sound in Hagia Sophia does not reverberate, it accumulates. A note sung in the center of the floor takes 11 seconds to die, which means that if you sing a phrase of chant at normal speed, the entire phrase is still alive and vibrating in the air when you have finished it. The later notes overlap the earlier ones, building into a layered sonic object of extraordinary complexity. The phrase continues to sing after you have stopped. Musicologist Bisera Pencheva has argued, after years of research combining acoustic measurement with historical musicology, that Byzantine liturgical chant cannot be properly understood as music in isolation. It is one component of a two-component system, the other component being the acoustic environment of Hagia Sophia itself. The melodic structure of Byzantine chant, its specific interval patterns, its approach to ornamentation, its relationship between soloist and choir, is designed to exploit 11 seconds of reverberation, the way a jazz musician designs a phrase to exploit the sustain of a piano pedal. The two elements, music and space, were composed together. Separated, neither sounds entirely finished. Together, in the building the music was written for, they produce a unified, sonic object of a kind that has no equivalent in the Western musical tradition. The loss of Hagia Sophia to the Christian liturgical tradition, its conversion to a mosque in 1453, its extended subsequent career as a museum, its reconversion to a mosque in 2020, has meant that the music written for it has spent most of the last 5 centuries being performed in spaces that do not allow it to be what it was designed to be. The building is still standing, the acoustic is unchanged, the music is largely preserved. The reunion of the two, the complete performance of Byzantine chant in the space it was composed for, remains one of the great unrealized possibilities of the early music world. Travel west now, from Istanbul to Cordoba in southern Spain, and you find the third of these extraordinary buildings in the least expected setting. The Mesquita, the great mosque of Cordoba, begun in 785 CE by the Umayyad ruler Abd al-Rahman I and expanded repeatedly over the following 2 centuries, is now, after the construction of a Catholic cathedral in its center during the 16th century, a hybrid structure of almost vertiginous complexity. Its most famous feature is the forest of columns and double arches that fill its prayer hall, over 800 columns of jasper, onyx, marble, and granite, supporting an upper tier of arches so that each column appears to spring twice, the lower red and white, the upper carrying the vaulted ceiling above. Walking through this space is unlike walking through any Gothic cathedral. The Gothic nave channels you forward toward the altar with an acoustic inevitability that has its own kind of authority. The Mesquita surrounds you, every direction is equally complex, equally beautiful, equally resonant. The acoustic character of the Mesquita is determined by its forest of close-spaced columns, each one a scatterer of sound, each pair of arches a resonating cavity at a different height above the floor. The result is a sound field of remarkable uniformity and complexity. Sound arrives at every point in the hall from dozens of slightly different directions, giving the space an acoustic intimacy and richness that the more dramatic Gothic cathedral does not attempt. Islamic prayer, built around the rhythmic recitation of Arabic text at specific timbres and at specific volumes, fills the Mesquita differently from Gregorian chant filling a Gothic nave, but the fit is equally exact, and the acoustic character of the building equally suited to the music made inside it. The same knowledge, expressed in different idioms, shaped by different traditions, devoted to different theological content, but drawing from the same ancient understanding that sacred space and sacred sound are not 2 things, but one. In the 13th century, if you wanted to learn how to build a cathedral, you did not go to a university. You did not read a textbook. There were no textbooks, not in the sense of systematic, technical manuals, covering the full range of practical knowledge that cathedral construction required. What you did was find a master, present yourself for acceptance into his lodge, and then spend years working beside him in conditions of progressive initiation, receiving knowledge in the proportion and at the pace that the master judged appropriate, learning through your body what your mind could only begin to describe. This system, the lodge, was not primarily a labor organization, although it functioned as one. It was a knowledge transmission system, and its structure was determined by the nature of the knowledge it transmitted. Some of what a cathedral builder needed to know could be expressed in geometric rules of thumb, in proportional relationships that could be drawn with a compass and straight edge, in structural principles that could be codified and memorized. These elements could, in principle, and have been written down. Some of them were, eventually, the handful of surviving medieval architectural drawings and the few technical manuscripts that have come down to us show a genuine tradition of written technical knowledge. But acoustic knowledge is different in kind. You cannot learn what a room sounds like from a diagram. The experience of standing inside a building with 7 seconds of reverberation, the experience of hearing your own voice return to you from all directions simultaneously, enriched with harmonics the stone has added, transformed into something your voice alone could never produce. This is not something that survives transcription. You must feel it. And having felt it, you need to feel it again and again, in different buildings, at different stages of completion, in different weather, with different numbers of people present, listening through different frequencies and at different positions within the space. Acoustic wisdom, like the wisdom of the musician, is bodily wisdom. It lives in the body, not the book. This is why the lodge system was the appropriate vehicle for transmitting it. Apprentices spent years on building sites, traveling from one cathedral project to the next, accumulating experience in their bodies of what different proportional choices produced acoustically. The master did not explain acoustics in theoretical terms. He pointed, he demonstrated, he said, listen to this space, now listen to this one. Do you hear the difference? Can you say why? And the apprentice listened and tried to say, and the master corrected or confirmed, and the knowledge transferred, not as data, but as perception, not as concept, but as skill. The few surviving lodge manuscripts tell us something about the nature of this transmitted knowledge. The Regius poem, written in approximately 1390, and the earliest known Masonic document in English, opens not with instructions for laying foundations or cutting stone, but with a meditation on music, geometry, and the harmony of the universe. It describes the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, as the foundation of the builder's craft. In music and geometry, listed side by side, as equal foundations of the same practice, not as decoration, not as cultural enrichment, but as craft knowledge, as things the builder must understand in order to build, the symbolic language that pervades the lodge documents, the perfect ashlar, the rough stone, the lost word, the sacred architecture of Solomon's temple, has been read for centuries primarily as moral allegory. But the lost word is a specific term. It refers to a sound, a vibration, a frequency whose knowledge was considered so fundamental and so powerful that it was transmitted only to the innermost initiates. What that word was, what frequency it corresponded to, whether it was genuinely lost in the Reformation's dispersal of the guilds, or whether it persists somewhere in the most private levels of whatever remains of the lodge tradition. These are questions that have no certain answer, but they are not questions invented by romantics. They are questions that the documents themselves pose. Draw 2 overlapping circles of equal size, positioning them so that the edge of each passes through the center of the other. The shape formed in the overlapping region, the pointed oval, the almond-shaped intersection between the 2 circles, is called the vesica piscis, Latin for the bladder of a fish. It is one of the oldest geometric figures in the human record, appearing in the art and sacred architecture of ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient Mesopotamia, and early Christianity, where it frames the Christ figure in the earliest medieval images of the divine. It is also the generating figure of Gothic cathedral design. In cathedral after cathedral, Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, Wells, Amiens, Lincoln, Salisbury, the floor plan, the cross-section, and the elevation can be derived from a sequence of overlapping circles whose intersection produces the vesica piscis. How the width of the nave relates to its height through the proportional ratio inherent in the vesica, a ratio of 1 to the square root of 3, approximately 1 to 1.732. The proportions of the transept crossing, the relationship between the height of the triforium gallery and the height of the clerestory above it, the width to height relationship of the individual bays, all of these can be generated geometrically from the vesica piscis and the sequence of proportions it produces. Why this shape? The theological answer is that the vesica piscis was a symbol of Christ, of divine creation, of the boundary between two worlds, and embedding it in the proportions of a church made the building itself an expression of divine geometry. This is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The acoustic answer goes deeper. A rectangular room with simple integer dimensions, a room whose width is exactly half its length, for example, or exactly 2/3 its length, creates a specific acoustic problem at the frequencies corresponding to those simple ratios. Sound waves bouncing back and forth between opposite walls interfere with each other in a regular pattern. Some positions in the room receive double energy. The wave arrivals add together. Others receive almost none. The arrivals cancel. These cancellation zones, called nodes, mean that in some spots in the room a sound is almost inaudible, while in nearby spots it is overwhelming. The acoustic field is uneven, lumpy, unreliable, and the vesica piscis ratio, 1 to the square root of 3, disrupts this pattern because the square root of 3 is irrational. It cannot be expressed as a simple fraction. The relationship between the room dimensions does not produce a simple repeating interference pattern. The nodes and antinodes are distributed more evenly, more subtly, more richly. The acoustic field is smoother. Sound reaching every position in the room arrives with something closer to the same total energy as sound reaching any other position. The building sounds consistent from every location within it, rather than varying dramatically from spot to spot. This is not a property that the medieval builders could have derived from acoustic theory. It is a property that they could have discovered empirically through the accumulated experience of building and listening, of comparing buildings with different proportions and attending carefully to the difference in how they sounded, gradually converging on the proportional system that worked best, and then encoded in geometric tools that could be transmitted and applied without any explicit understanding of why they worked. The ad quadratum method, in which proportions are generated by rotating a square 45 degrees within itself, each rotation producing a new dimension in the ratio of 1 to the square root of 2, and the ad triangulum method, in which an equilateral triangle inscribed in a circle generates proportions related to the square root of 3. Both appear in the few surviving records of medieval design practice. Both produce room dimensions that fall outside the simple integer ratios most likely to cause destructive acoustic interference, and both produce the harmonic, proportional relationships that make the acoustic field of a cathedral rich and even rather than patchy and inconsistent. The builders did not need to understand frequency. They needed to draw the right shapes. The knowledge was encoded in the geometry itself, and the geometry carried the acoustic wisdom forward through every building constructed by the masters who knew how to use it. In October 1517, Martin Luther nailed a list of objections to the door of a church in Wittenberg. Within a decade, the most consequential rupture in Western Christianity since the Great Schism was underway, and the acoustic world of European sacred space was about to be stripped down to its bare walls. The Protestant reformers were, in important respects, correct about the Catholic Church. The elaborate sensory environment of the medieval Mass, the incense, the coloured glass, and the Latin that the congregation could not understand, the reverberant music that passed directly through the body without engaging the rational mind, was, as Luther and Calvin and Zwingli argued, a form of manipulation. It was designed to produce a specific kind of experience in the congregation, and it succeeded in producing it. And the experience it produced was one that bypassed comprehension, bypassed critical thought, bypassed the individual's own judgment about the content of the faith being delivered. It went straight to the body. It went straight to the autonomic nervous system and the limbic system and the ancient parts of the brain that do not reason but simply respond. The reformers wanted people to think, to read scripture in their own language, to evaluate doctrine rationally, to engage with their faith as adults engaging with text and argument, not as participants in a sensory ritual that left them temporarily altered and permanently compliant. These were not unreasonable aims. The corruption of the late medieval church, the indulgences, the political manipulation, the exploitation of lay piety for institutional gain, gave the reformers' critique considerable force. In reformed congregations across Northern Europe, the organs were silenced or removed. The stone surfaces were whitewashed. The ornate screens were torn down. The chant was replaced with metrical psalm singing in the vernacular. Direct, rhythmic, intelligible, designed to engage the mind rather than the body. The acoustic environment of the Reformed Church was stripped of every feature the medieval tradition had spent centuries building into its sacred spaces. The reverberation time dropped from 7 seconds to 2. The infrasound frequencies died when the organ pipes were removed. The communion of synchronized heartbeats ended when the complex, sustained chant of the Latin liturgy was replaced with the clipped syllables of direct vernacular speech. What the reformers could not have known, what no one who dismantled the acoustic tradition of the Gothic cathedral could have fully understood, was that most of what they were destroying predated Christianity by thousands of years. The Pythagorean ratios in the proportions, the resonating ceramic vessels in the walls, and the orientation and siting of the buildings chosen for their acoustic isolation. None of this was specifically Christian. It was an inheritance from a tradition far older and far more universal than the medieval Catholic Church, a tradition that had been building sound into sacred space since the megalithic period, that had crossed civilizations and been carried through catastrophes, and that had survived Rome and the Dark Ages and the Crusades, and had finally been embedded in the stone of the greatest buildings Christian Europe ever produced. When the Reformation silenced those buildings, or more precisely, when the building of new sacred spaces according to the old acoustic principles ceased, and the old buildings were stripped of their acoustic features, Tam and the guilds that had transmitted the knowledge dispersed without successors. A thread snapped that had run unbroken from the Neolithic chambered tombs of Scotland to the Gothic cathedrals of France. The knowledge did not vanish immediately or completely. Fragments persisted in Masonic symbolism, in the proportional systems of a few later architects who had access to the lodge tradition, in the embodied practice of a diminishing number of builders who still knew what the shapes they were drawing were actually for. But the tradition, as a living, transmitted, practiced body of knowledge, was broken. What took its place was not nothing. It was the beginning of a science of acoustics, based on measurement and theory rather than geometry and experience. That science took 2 centuries to develop, to the point where it could begin to ask the right questions. And when it finally did, it discovered that the answers had been standing in stone all along. In the late 1980s, a French musicologist named Igor Reznikov went into the caves, not as an archaeologist primarily, though he worked with archaeologists. He went as a musician, armed with his own trained voice and an acute understanding of acoustic environments, to answer a question that the archaeology of Paleolithic cave painting had never quite thought to ask. Why here? The Paleolithic artists who painted the walls of Lascaux, of Altamira, of Peshmerl, of Font de Golmy, chose their painting locations with care. They went deep into the rock, sometimes considerable distances, into spaces that required effort and time to reach. They painted in specific locations within those spaces, not wherever the wall was smooth and available, not wherever the light from their lamps happened to fall, but in specific spots that recur with a consistency that demands an explanation. Reznikov thought he understood what the explanation might be. He went through the caves singing, moving through the dark, making sounds, listening to how the cave responded, where the echo was richest, where standing waves built with the most intensity, where the cave's own resonance transformed his voice into something fuller and stranger than it was in the open air. Then he mapped those locations against the locations of the painted images. The correlation was not approximate or suggestive. It was, he reported, essentially complete. Where the cave sang, the paintings were. The artists had painted at the places where the rock itself made sound extraordinary. They had painted where the cave was an instrument. The implications of this finding, which Reznikov published, and which have been replicated and extended by subsequent researchers in cave after cave, are difficult to overstate. They mean that the earliest known art, the oldest images made by human hands, was placed in locations selected for their acoustic properties, that the relationship between sacred imagery and resonant sound is not a medieval Christian innovation or a product of any particular civilization. It is something older than civilization. It is, in some form, as old as the human impulse toward the sacred itself. Paul Devereux took these implications further, and spending years measuring the acoustic properties of megalithic structures across Britain and Ireland and showing the same pattern at a larger scale. Prehistoric stone circles, chambered tombs, and standing stone arrangements were positioned and constructed with consistent attention to acoustic effect. His Dragon project, which he ran through the 1980s and early 1990s, documented infrasonic and ultrasonic anomalies at these sites as standing wave patterns that concentrate acoustic energy at specific points within the structures, and architectural features whose function appears primarily acoustic rather than structural or decorative. At the other end of the world, Miriam Kohler documented something still more specific in the temple complex of Chavin de Huántar in the Peruvian Andes. The labyrinthine corridors of this 3,000-year-old ceremonial complex, she showed, and were not merely passages through which initiates moved. They were acoustic instruments, designed so that sound made in certain locations, specifically the deep, resonant blast of a Strombus shell trumpet, would be transformed by the corridors and chambers into a sound closely resembling the territorial call of a jaguar. The jaguar was a symbol of shamanic transformation in Andean cosmology. The building produced its sound deliberately, architecturally, for specific ritual purposes. The convergence of these findings from independent researchers working in different countries and different periods of human history points toward a single conclusion: that academic archaeology has been slow to absorb, in part because it overturns several comfortable assumptions about the cognitive sophistication of pre-literate cultures. The deliberate engineering of sound in sacred space is among the most ancient human practices we know of. It appears on every inhabited continent. It persists across every major transition in religious and cultural form. The builders of the great cathedrals were not beginning a tradition. They were continuing one whose beginning we have not yet found. There is a ward in a hospital in Northern Europe where patients recovering from cardiac surgery are given, as part of their standard post-operative protocol, daily sessions of immersion in a specific acoustic environment. Low-frequency tones in the range between 40 and 80 hertz are unsustained for 20 to 30 minutes, delivered through a system of transducers built into the chair or bed the patient sits or lies in. The treatment is not music therapy in the conventional sense. It is not designed to provide emotional comfort or distraction. It is designed to deliver specific frequency vibrations to the body's tissue and organ systems at the intensities and frequencies most associated with physiological regulation and repair. The patients recover faster, not marginally faster, measurably, statistically significantly faster, with shorter hospital stays, lower complication rates, and improved pain management outcomes. The frequencies being used correspond closely to the low-frequency content of the acoustic environment inside a Gothic cathedral when the organ is playing. Whether the hospital administrators know this particular historical parallel is unclear. The acoustic engineers who designed the treatment protocol do. The science connecting specific acoustic frequencies to specific physiological effects has developed substantially over the past 3 decades, moving from the margins of alternative medicine toward the center of evidence-based practice. What it has found is a consistent pattern. The human body responds therapeutically to low-frequency acoustic stimulation in ways that have nothing to do with the subjective experience of music or the psychological comfort of sound. The vibrations interact directly with tissue, with cellular membranes, with the autonomic nervous system's regulatory functions. They do this regardless of whether the person receiving them considers the sound pleasant or meaningful. The documented benefits cluster around several areas: singing in reverberant acoustic spaces, the kind of singing that a Gothic cathedral provides, and that modern concert halls and churches rarely come close to, produces measurable decreases in cortisol, the stress hormone, and measurable increases in immunoglobulin A, an antibody that is a primary marker of immune system function. These findings have been replicated across multiple research groups in multiple countries. Choral singing in stone spaces does not merely feel good. It demonstrably improves immune function. The low-frequency component of the cathedral acoustic environment, including the infrasonic output of the pipe organ and the building's own structural resonance, has been studied for its effects on anxiety and chronic pain, with findings consistent enough that it has begun to attract serious clinical attention. The therapeutic mechanism is not fully understood, but the most plausible models involve the direct stimulation of the vagus nerve, which is sensitive to vibrations at low frequencies and which governs a broad range of autonomic regulatory functions, including heart rate, blood pressure, and inflammatory response. A tuned stone space in this reading is not simply a place where music sounds beautiful. It is a physiological environment that actively supports the healing and regulation of the bodies within it. Jonathan Goldman, working at the boundary between sound research and healing practice, has proposed that the harmonic proportions built into cathedral architecture produce acoustic environments that are uniquely restorative to the human nervous system, environments in which the frequencies present correspond harmonically and spatially to the natural resonant frequencies of the body's own organ systems. The cathedral, in this view, is a healing instrument, built, whether its builders would have used this language or not, for the restoration of the people who entered it. The medieval builders would not have described their work in these terms. They would have used the language of theology, of sacred geometry, of the harmonious ordering of divine creation expressed in stone. But the effects they were producing, the physiological transformation, the acoustic healing, the neurological and immunological benefits of sustained immersion in a harmonically tuned, resonant environment were real. They are measurable, and they are being rediscovered piece by piece in hospitals and research laboratories by scientists who may not know they are following a path that was first laid down 9 centuries ago. In the 1960s, a Swiss physician and natural scientist named Hans Jenny developed a method for making the invisible structure of sound visible. He spread fine sand or water, or lycopodium powder, on flat plates, connected those plates to speakers or oscillators, and applied sustained tones at specific frequencies in what appeared on the surface of the material was extraordinary. The random distribution of particles resolved instantly and completely into a geometric pattern, symmetrical, precise, beautiful, different for every frequency, the same for that frequency every time. At low frequencies, the patterns were simple, concentric rings, simple grids. As the frequency rose, the patterns became more complex, more articulate, more detailed, until at certain frequencies, the surface of the plate filled with a figure so intricate and so perfectly symmetrical that it looked less like a physical phenomenon and more like a design, like a snowflake, like a mandala, like the tracery of a rose window. Jenny named the field of study cymatics, from the Greek word for wave, and his photographs and films remain among the most striking visual demonstrations of a physical principle that most people encounter as abstract theory. Sound has shape, and every frequency has its own shape, consistent and reproducible, determined by the mathematics of wavel interference. The geometry of sound is real, and it can be seen. The implications for understanding sacred architecture are difficult to set aside once you have seen the images. When medieval stone carvers produced the geometric tracery of Gothic windows, the interlocking circles, the petal forms, the complex radiating patterns of the great rose windows, they were working from patterns, from templates, from traditions of design, from geometric instructions. And when you compare those patterns to the cymatic figures produced at the frequencies most prominent in the Gothic cathedral's own acoustic environment, the correspondence is not merely suggestive, it is specific enough to generate genuine unease in anyone who has spent time with both bodies of evidence. The cymatic pattern produced at 111 Hz, the resonant frequency of the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, is also one of the principal resonances of many Gothic naves, shows a geometric figure bearing a close resemblance to specific patterns found in Gothic window tracery, in Islamic geometric art, and in the carved stone rosettes of early medieval architecture. The pattern produced at 432 Hz, the traditional pitch standard of medieval chant, produces a figure that recurs in slightly different forms across the decorative art of multiple sacred traditions. Whether these correspondences are the result of deliberate encoding, whether the stone carvers were literally carving the cymatic patterns of the building's resonant frequencies into the ornamental surfaces, or whether they reflect a deeper correspondence between the geometry that produces musical consonance and the geometry that the human eye finds beautiful, is a question that leads rapidly into philosophical territory that no acoustic engineer can navigate alone. What the evidence suggests, taken together, is this: the great sacred buildings of the ancient and medieval world were not merely decorated, they were inscribed. The patterns on their surfaces, the geometric tracery, the symbolic ornament, the intricate carvings, were related in ways that we are only beginning to understand to the acoustic behavior of the spaces they inhabited. The buildings were, in some sense, pictures of their own frequencies. The stone carried the geometry of the sound it was built to produce, visible on every surface, readable by those who knew the language. Sound, given a surface, draws its own cathedral. Walk out of any great medieval cathedral and stand on the street outside. The transition is immediate, and once you have spent any time inside, genuinely unpleasant. The noise of the modern city, the traffic, the construction, the compressed audio of music played through small speakers at excessive volumes, and the overlapping conversations, the machine hum of ventilation and refrigeration, and the electromagnetic chatter of 1,000 devices arrives all at once, without the cathedral's stone wall to filter it, without any acoustic architecture to shape or channel it. It is simply there, loud, continuous, structurally incoherent, designed by nobody. The average background noise level in a modern European city centre is between 60 and 80 decibels. For context, 60 decibels is roughly the volume of a normal conversation held at a distance of about 1 metre. The city is maintaining that level continuously, around the clock, from sources too numerous and too diverse to count. Researchers who study the effects of chronic noise exposure have mapped the physiological consequences with considerable precision. Sustained noise at these levels elevates cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, and keeps it elevated. It increases cardiovascular risk. It disrupts sleep architecture, even at levels below the threshold of conscious waking. It impairs cognitive function, particularly the higher order executive functions associated with creativity, problem solving, and sustained attention. And it produces, over years and decades of exposure, a condition that some researchers have begun to call acoustic numbing, a progressive reduction in the nervous system's sensitivity to subtle sonic information as the brain adapts to the constant assault of broadband noise by turning down the gain on its auditory processing. We are becoming acoustically deaf to the subtler parts of our own sonic environment, because our sonic environment has given us no reason to remain sensitive to them, and many reasons to tune them out. The contrast with the interior of a Gothic cathedral is not merely a matter of volume. It is a matter of the entire qualitative character of the acoustic environment. The cathedral was not simply quieter than the medieval town outside its walls, though it was significantly quieter, its stone mass providing effective isolation from the noise of the market, the animals, the weather. It was acoustically ordered. Every sound inside it was shaped, directed, reflected, sustained, enriched by the architectural geometry of the space. The building was not a vessel that happened to contain sound. It was a structure that processed sound, transforming the raw acoustic energy of voices and instruments into something harmonically organized, physiologically specific, and neurologically effective. The person sitting in a modern open-plan office, exposed to the continuous background chatter of nearby conversations, the irregular percussion of keyboards, the white noise hum of ventilation, the tinny intrusion of music from someone else's headphones, is receiving acoustic stimuli that their nervous system processes as mild, chronic threat. Not danger exactly, but the constant low-level demand of an acoustic environment that contains no order, no structure, no design intention, and therefore no signal that rest is available or safety has been achieved. The medieval cathedral offered the opposite of this. It offered a space in which the acoustic environment itself communicated safety, order, and the presence of something larger than the individual's own concerns. Whether that larger presence was conceived theologically or neurologically, it produced the same physiological effect. The nervous system relaxed, the stress response quieted, the body began to restore itself. We have not decided that this is something we no longer need. We have simply forgotten to build it. The buildings are still standing, thus this is perhaps the single most important fact about the acoustic tradition of the Gothic cathedral. The physical objects through which it expressed its highest achievements were built to last, and they have lasted, and they still function acoustically with something very close to the precision their builders intended. Chartres still has its 5.5-second reverberation. Hagia Sophia still holds its 11 seconds of suspended sound. The King's Chamber still resonates at 111 Hz. Salisbury still has its note, its fundamental frequency woven into the length and height of its great nave. The buildings are instruments that have been sitting in their cases for centuries, and when you open the case, they play. Most visitors do not know how to listen to them. They walk through with audio guides, receiving information about architectural history and theological symbolism, looking at the windows and the stonework, taking photographs. They experience the acoustic environment as a pleasant ambient quality, big sound, nice reverb, rather than as the primary and most sophisticated achievement of the building they are standing in. But a visitor who has spent time with the ideas in this documentary will notice things that the audio guide does not mention. They will find the crossing, the point where the nave and transept intersect, the structural and acoustic heart of the building, and stand there and listen. At the crossing, the sound from all four arms of the cruciform plan converges. The reflected energy from north and south, from east and west, arrives simultaneously and from all directions, creating the most complex and the richest acoustic field in the building. It is the place where the instrument is most fully audible to itself. They will find the choir and notice how the stone screen, where it survives, changes the acoustic character of the space as they pass through it. The reverberant nave, where sound comes from everywhere, gives way to a more intimate, more focused acoustic field, where the carved surfaces of the screen and stalls create a denser, shorter-tailed reverberation suited to the precision of polyphonic singing. They are passing from one acoustic room into another, and both were designed. They will find the crypt, if it exists and if it is open, and discover that the lower, smaller, more intimate acoustic of the underground spaces, shorter reverberation, tighter reflections, a more personal scale of sound, was another instrument entirely, suited to the private prayers and individual encounters that the vast public space above was not designed for. Contemporary composers understand the living nature of these buildings in a way that most architects do not. Arvo Pärt, whose minimalist compositions have become among the most listened to pieces of music written in the last 50 years, does not consider his work complete in a recording studio or a concert hall. His music, sparse, sustained, built from simple harmonic intervals, separated by long silences, reveals its full nature only in a reverberant stone space where the sustained notes blossom into harmonic complexity. In the reverberation, and the silences are not empty, but charged with the dying tale of the previous phrase. He writes for the building as much as for the performers, and the building is the final instrument in his ensemble. John Tavener said something similar, that his sacred music was written for spaces where the stone itself participates in the sound. The buildings are waiting, the knowledge of how to use them is available. The tradition is broken, but the vessels that held it are standing. In 2011, a team of some of the world's most technically sophisticated acoustic engineers was commissioned to design a new major concert hall for a European city, and the project had a significant budget. The full resources of contemporary acoustic modeling software, access to every measurement technique available in modern acoustic science, and a mandate to produce a room of the highest possible acoustic quality. The team decided, reasonably enough, to begin by studying the best acoustic spaces already in existence, to establish a baseline for what they were trying to achieve. They went to the cathedrals. What they found there prompted a paper subsequently published in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America that has been quietly circulating among acoustic engineers and architectural acousticians ever since, with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. The paper's findings were straightforward in their expression and extraordinary in their implications. Despite the availability of computational fluid dynamics, modeling that can predict the behavior of a sound wave to within a fraction of a millisecond, and despite the use of scale models tested in anechoic chambers, despite decades of accumulated research and practice in the design of high-quality acoustic spaces, despite all of this, the team could not replicate the acoustic quality of a 12th century Gothic cathedral. Not approximately, not within a reasonable margin of engineering error. They could not come close. The particular quality they found impossible to replicate was not the reverberation time. Modern rooms can be designed to any target reverberation time with considerable accuracy. It was not the frequency response. Modern materials and geometries give acoustic engineers extensive control over which frequencies a space emphasizes. It was something harder to name and harder to measure, a quality of diffuseness, of spatial evenness, of the acoustic field's distribution throughout the space, that the cathedral possessed in a degree that no modern building had achieved. The sound in a Gothic cathedral arrives at every position in the space from so many angles, with such subtle variations in timing and frequency that it creates a sense of acoustic immersion, of being inside the sound rather than in the presence of it, that modern modeling cannot reliably predict or reproduce. The paper was careful not to claim that medieval builders possessed knowledge that modern science lacks. It stopped well short of that conclusion. But the implication was unmistakable to anyone who read it. The acoustic quality of the great Gothic cathedrals is not fully explained by anything in modern acoustic theory. There is something in the geometry, in the proportional systems, in the specific combination of materials and forms and orientations that these buildings embody, that produces acoustic effects we can measure but not yet fully account for and cannot yet reliably replicate. Say the builders who produced these effects had no frequency analyzers. They had no reverberation time calculators. They had no computational models. They had compass, straight edge, plumb line, and a geometric tradition whose acoustic implications had been tested and refined across thousands of years of building and listening. And what they built at the end of that long process of empirical refinement was something that the best equipped acoustic engineers of the 21st century have looked at with genuine, documented admiration, and privately, in the notes of the professionals involved, a degree of humility that the published literature understates. The greatest acoustic spaces in human history were built by people who had no theory of what made them great. They had something that predated theory, something that was, in its own terms, more complete, and we have not yet found a name for what it was. There is a way to look at the evidence accumulated across these 9 chapters: the acoustic archaeology, the neurophysiology, the geometric analysis, the historical record, the modern engineering's admission of failure, and arrive at a conclusion that is simultaneously more modest and more extraordinary than anything the medieval church would have claimed for its own buildings. The great cathedrals were not primarily buildings. Instead, they were technologies of consciousness. Consider what that phrase requires us to accept. A technology is a purposeful tool, something designed and built to produce a specific, reliable, repeatable outcome. A technology of consciousness is a tool designed to produce a specific, reliable, repeatable outcome in the interior experience of the human beings who use it. It is a machine for changing people, not by force, not by instruction, not by argument, but by the direct manipulation of the sensory and neurological conditions in which inner experience occurs. The cathedrals were this. The evidence is now substantial enough that the description is not metaphorical. The acoustic tuning of the space, precise, consistent, carried across 9 centuries of building in a single tradition and producing the same characteristic reverberation, time, and the same harmonic frequency distribution in building after building, was designed to produce a specific state of acoustic immersion in the people inside it. The infrasonic component of the organ's output, amplified by the resonating chamber of the nave, was designed to produce specific physiological effects in those people. The sense of presence, the suppression of ordinary self-referential thought, and the permeability of the boundary between individual and environment. The music composed for these buildings was optimized to exploit the acoustic environment in ways that deepened these effects rather than interrupting them. The orientation, the siting, the management of external noise, all of this protected the acoustic environment from disruption, ensuring that the technology could function at the level of reliability its designers intended. What was the intended outcome? What were the builders trying to produce? The evidence suggests that they were trying to produce the experience that their tradition called the presence of God, but which, described in physiological terms, is an altered state characterized by the suppression of the default mode network. the elevation of social bonding neurochemistry, the deepening of somatic awareness, and the temporary dissolution of the boundary between individual self and the larger environment. In this state, a person is more open, more trusting, more capable of the kinds of perception and insight that ordinary contracted selfhood makes difficult. They are also, as the medieval church was well aware, more receptive to the content of the message being delivered in this altered state context. Whether you call this state divine presence or neurological alteration, whether you describe the mechanism in theological or physiological language, one thing about it is consistent across every framework. It is real. The people who experienced it were having genuine experiences. Those experiences were consequential. They shaped values, behaviors, relationships, the entire texture of medieval, social, and spiritual life. And they were supported, facilitated, and in many cases made possible by a physical environment that had been designed with extraordinary skill and across an extraordinarily long tradition, and to produce exactly those experiences in the people who entered it. The medieval cathedral was not a building with good acoustics. It was a machine for altering human consciousness, designed by people who understood the relationship between sound, space, and the inner life of the human body better than we do today. They called what they built a house of God. What they were actually building, in the language available to them at the time, in stone, in proportion, in the harmonics of their music and the infrasonic depths of their organ pipes, was an environment in which the distance between ordinary waking consciousness and whatever lies beyond it could be reliably, repeatedly, and for almost anyone, temporarily closed. We have underestimated them. In doing so, we have impoverished ourselves. And the question now is whether we understand them well enough to learn, at last, from what they left behind. The knowledge encoded in the great cathedrals is not gone. It has never been gone. It has been standing in stone in the middle of European cities for 900 years, available to anyone willing to look at it carefully enough and listen with enough attention. What has been missing is not the knowledge itself, but the framework for understanding what the knowledge is. That framework is now being assembled, piece by piece, by researchers who do not always know they are working on the same problem from different directions. The acoustic archaeologists who document resonant, sacred spaces across millennia. The neuroscientists who map the physiological effects of reverberant sound environments on the human nervous system. The musicologists who demonstrate the acoustic specificity of sacred music traditions. The materials scientists who analyze the resonant properties of the stone and glass from which the buildings were made. The acoustic engineers who find themselves unable to explain, with all their tools, what makes the buildings work the way they do. These researchers are collectively recovering, in the language of modern science, a body of knowledge that was once expressed in the language of geometry, proportion, and the transmitted practice of the builder's lodge. And the practical implications of what they are recovering are only beginning to be applied. Schools designed with the acoustic principles underlying cathedral architecture, controlled reverberation, frequency-conscious surface treatment, attention to the ratio between room dimensions, show measurable improvements in the ability of students to concentrate and to retain spoken information. The effect is not trivial. Researchers have found improvements in test scores, in reductions in teacher vocal strain, and reductions in student stress levels attributable specifically to acoustic design quality. The acoustic environment of a learning space is not a luxury. It is a fundamental determinant of how well learning happens. Hospitals that have introduced acoustic treatment designed according to similar principles, not cathedral-scale reverberation, which would be clinically counterproductive, but the same underlying philosophy of purposeful frequency management and the reduction of unstructured acoustic stress, report improvements in patient outcomes, staff performance, and the subjective experience of care quality by both patients and caregivers. The acoustic environment of a healing space is not peripheral to healing. It is part of the treatment. Offices, public spaces, transportation terminals, housing. These are all acoustic environments that are currently designed almost universally, with no intention beyond the reduction of the most severe acoustic problems. Intelligibility targets, noise level limits, reverberation, time constraints. These are the tools of modern acoustic design in built environments, and they address the problem of acoustic discomfort, but do not approach the question of acoustic well-being. They tell you how to avoid a bad room. They do not tell you how to build a good one. They do not tell you because the knowledge of what a good room actually does to the people inside it has not yet been fully integrated into the design practice that determines how most of the world is built. But there is a subtler implication that goes beyond the practical. If specific acoustic environments reliably produce specific states of inner experience, if the acoustic conditions of the space you inhabit are a primary determinant of the quality of your inner life, moment to moment and year to year, then acoustic environment is not a background condition. It is a fundamental dimension of the built environment's effect on human flourishing, and our current practice of designing that dimension with no intention, with no regard for its effects, with the sole goal of avoiding egregious dysfunction, is not neutral. It is an active impoverishment of the conditions in which human life is lived. The people who built the great cathedrals understood this in a way that we have lost and are slowly recovering. They understood that the quality of the space in which people gathered to be human together was not incidental to the quality of the being human they were capable of doing there. They built their understanding into stone with a precision and a care that has outlasted every other achievement of their civilization. The buildings are still standing, the acoustic is unchanged, and the effects are still real. Every person who enters one of these spaces and feels something, the slowing of breath, the quieting of thought, the opening into something larger, is receiving, 9 centuries later, exactly what the builders intended to deliver. We are not so far from them as we thought. The thread is broken, but the vessels are full. What we need is not new knowledge. It is the willingness to recover what was always there, standing in stone, is singing in frequencies below the range of conscious hearing, waiting for the moment when we were ready to listen properly. Come back one more time to the cathedral. It is early in the morning, early enough that the light through the east windows is still rising. The gold of the winter dawn just beginning to reach through the high clerestory and touch the vault above the choir. The building is empty. The tourists have not come. The daily mass is not yet begun. There is only the stone and the silence, and even the silence is not really silent. It is the residual presence of every sound the building has ever held, its acoustic memory, the frequency signature of 9 centuries of voices and music and prayer, and the deep sub-audible drone of the organ's lowest pipes vibrating in the walls. You walk through the west door and the city outside ceases. Not gradually, immediately. The stone walls cut the urban world off with a totality that no glass or drywall or modern acoustic treatment approaches, because they were designed to do this deliberately as part of the function of the building, the function that preceded all the theological functions, the function inherited from the megalithic stone chambers of 10,000 years ago. The building creates silence. It withdraws you from the acoustic world outside and delivers you into the acoustic world it controls. You walk down the nave, and you know now what you are walking through. You know that the vault above your head is shaped the way it is not only for structural reasons, but because its ribbed, irregular geometry scatters sound in the frequencies most likely to produce destructive interference elsewhere. You know that the ratio of the height to the width to the length of the space around you is not arbitrary, that it was chosen from a tradition of geometric knowledge older than the medieval church, because it produces a resonant acoustic field that is harmonically rich and spatially even. You know that the carved stone corbels along the walls are not merely decoration, and that the side chapels are not simply additional prayer space, and that the choir screen is not primarily about the division of ecclesiastical from lay space. You know what the building is. It is an instrument, and it is playing. You stop at the crossing, where the nave meets the transept, and you stand still and you listen. The building is not silent here. It is breathing, the faint sound of your own footsteps reverberating in the distance. A breath of air moving through some high window, the almost imperceptible vibration of the stone itself, responding to whatever infrasound the earth and the traffic and the distant activity of the city is sending through the ground. The air is filled with frequencies below the range of your hearing, and your body is receiving them in the way a body always receives infrasound, not as music, not as noise, but as a kind of pressure in the tissues, a bass note felt rather than heard, a reminder that you are a physical object in a physical world, and both of you are vibrating. Your inner voice, the running commentary, the plans, the anxieties, the habitual chatter of a modern mind, is quieter now. Not because you have decided to quiet it, because the acoustic environment is doing to your nervous system what it has always been designed to do. The default mode network is suppressing. The vagus nerve is responding to the low-frequency stimulation by down-regulating the sympathetic stress response. The neurochemistry of trust and openness is rising. You are physiologically See, in a state that the medieval builders called the receptive condition, the condition of readiness for an experience larger than ordinary waking consciousness permits. They built this for you, not for you specifically, for every person who would ever walk through this door, across all the centuries between their time and yours. They built it knowing that the body does not change, that the nervous system does not change, that the frequencies which open the human mind in one century open it in every century. They built it as a gift, wrapped in stone and proportion and the accumulated wisdom of a tradition so old that no one, then or now, has found its beginning. The note they tuned into these walls 9 centuries ago is still sounding. It will be sounding long after the names of everyone alive today are as lost as the names of the masters who built it. And the next time you step into a great building and feel something you cannot name, that quieting, that opening, that sense of having arrived somewhere that was waiting for you, you will know what you are feeling. You will know where it comes from. You will know that it was put there deliberately by people who understood something about the relationship between sound and the human soul that we are only now beginning to recover. And you will never quite hear silence the same way again.